Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My topic will be a little more provincial, I guess, but I hope you will enjoy. And if I miss anything, I will try to be as concise as possible. Yeah, but if you have any questions about the context, then I'm happy to answer after the talk. Right-wing populism, as you know, has been on the rise globally, and along with it, so has nationalist historical revisionism. In Hungary, the attempt has been in the making to write a historical national narrative that is acceptable and reifying for the government since 2010. Historical forgeries that are often materialized in urban space not only take place in the shape of narrative, but also through the commodification of history as a spectacle and as an object. I will explain these throughout my presentation. My dissertation mainly concerns itself with historical revisionism and its intersections with architecture and urban politics. My case study is the Royal Palace in Buda that you can see on the images, the left, for you as well, left part of the image, with comparative regional examples such as the Humboldt Forum in Berlin that you can see on the right side. This presentation aims to outline a part of my argument in the dissertation on how cultural heritage and the national form are affected by the logics of the market. I will highlight that such commodification praxis lead not only to a confused understanding of national form, but also to a confused idea of nation and the means of national belonging. So the first part of my presentation will be on the myths of national form and how I identify these categories. The upsurge of national myths in the 18th and 19th centuries served a dual function. On the one hand, to create a common national identity with shared points of historical reference, for example, moments of primordial national greatness, individuals who fought for the nation before the birth of the nation state, and we can see this to happen in all sorts of political contexts today. On the other hand, it was to ensure the legitimation of the elite state from the masses while safeguarding itself from socialism and radical nationalism at the same time. As historian Eric J. Hobsbawm reflected, the top-down creation of the toolkit of national symbolism in this way also distracted attention from class to nation. Such invented tradition, which is a term coined by Hobsbawm, served as a basis for political movements in the 20th century as well, but with very different results. While the socialist tradition had to invent its very new rituals like May Day, for instance, that you can see on the left side, it's one of the first images to capture the solidarity as a visual element. On the other hand, nationalism relied on revisionist methods to invent the neoclassicist new history with new continuities, such as finding exotic national origin stories like the Japanese descent of the Hungarian nation. I think, no, I didn't include it in the picture, but in the early decades of the 20th century, there was this big idea on the nationalist side of Hungarian intellectuals that the Hungarians actually came from Asia and from Japan, which was, of course, very much contested very early on, but it was a serious discourse on it. So monuments, public buildings, extravagant pieces of art were constructed on the grounds of such new and invented myths. The contradiction is, of course, in the fact that this all happened on the wings of global capitalism, which through political, economic, and cultural penetration had an immense homogenizing effect on art and culture. For this, we can see the example of Vienna-based streets in Budapest, the Habsburg influence in Trieste, Ljubljana, or Skopje, or the colonial architecture spreading from France and Portugal across the ocean. We talked about this extensively in this forum. And of course, this is not to say that it was all because of capitalism, but as we know, it's no coincidence that colonialism and capitalism thrived upon each other. So by the early 20th century, myths underlining national exceptionalism spread along with the acculturation and standardization of national form across the globe. As Hermann Broch wrote in Hofmannsthal und seine Zeit, the complete absence of style in the 19th century is a style on its own. However, the inventionalist attitude towards history in the 19th and 20th century did not immediately mean falsification. And I think this is an important point also in the forum to emphasize that the inventionalist attitude of nationalism doesn't mean that these myths didn't resonate or didn't originate from an existing part of the national sentiment. It often meant institutional research into the national past and a serious expertise debate, and we see this in historiography, anthropology, even in eugenics, that the discourse that would lead to the birth of the gene, and also architecture with the secessionist tendency in Budapest, Vienna, or the vernacular genres in architecture. At this point, nationalism is created through anachronism on the one hand, and in ways of craft and expertise on the other. We see that the cornerstones of nationalism are often invented traditions originating in the protectionist ideals of the 19th century nation building. The question today is, however, how is contemporary right-wing populism utilizing these myths, and how do we explain the revival of neo-historicism in such political contexts? In Hungary, since 2010, when the current government first got of a supermajority in parliament, we can see an overwhelming project to reconstruct the capital as if the Second World War or the socialist period never happened. We see this with Kossuth Square. If you've been to Budapest in the past couple of years, you might have witnessed a serious change in the heart of the city. And we also see this in the Royal Palace, which is the case of study here. And this also happens with the immense use of neoclassicist and neo-Baroque design. The Humboldt Forum in Berlin, a project in the reconstruction of the Prussian Royal Palace, has opened its doors in 2020, a similar example, but with very different, and I would love to have a debate on the Humboldt Forum, and maybe not on this session. And we also have the example of Skopje that I already mentioned, which has gained in the past year a complete new old look of the historicist town. The Humboldt Forum is a museum mainly concerning itself with its own contemporary history, but the buildings in Buda are either representational for the current government or mere exhibition sites or exclusive cafes. Keeping in mind the entangled national narratives in the Balkan region, Skopje, the case of Skopje cannot but seem very much like a project to Europeanize Macedonia and distance it from the rest of the region politically. We see in these examples that these old-new reconstructions are not mere historical forgeries, like saying something existed when it didn't, but they serve as representational functions as facades in the creation of a new national identity. However, in the Budapest examples, often the function of these new buildings in practical terms are unclear in terms of what happens inside, and I will explain this slide in a second. Often for their designers, the overwhelming majority of exhibition sites, cafes, restaurants in neoclassicist buildings draws us to the banal conclusion that these spaces are empty also in their meaning and illegitimate in their existence. And I brought this slide to show that on the upper picture, you can see the Royal Palace. These are with the dots, the parts that are under some kind of construction. And in these parts, what you can see is that they're reconstructing either the halls or some elements of the Royal Palace into their pre-war state, because the Royal Palace was heavily bombed in the Second World War, so most of its interior had to be significantly changed after the war in the following decades, according to socialist modernist interior design. Yesterday at the NDK, I had a very homely feeling of, by using the same materials, and it was a very familiar feeling. On the lower image, you can see a layout of the city park, Városliget, which is on the Pest side of Budapest, and with the yellow little bubbles, you can see where they're actually inserting into the park completely new buildings. Most of them are not replicas, as in the castle. They have made replicas in certain cases, but most of them are completely new. As, for instance, they just opened a new museum, which is huge and occupies most of the green area. But to go back to my original point, where one of the arguments against these reconstruction projects is that they don't include any significant function in them. They don't function as parts of a dialogue, but they only serve representative functions in the sense that they are exhibition sites or cafe. But another line of understanding might enlighten us that the representative function is only secondary and the primary function is that of consumption. When the previously mentioned historian Erik Hobsbawm writes that history as an inspiration, this is actually in the Kassel district, and I will tell you which ones are cafes or exhibition sites. This one, 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 also this one. And the rest have some, function like an office or some government place, but most of them are cafes, basically the same, very expensive. So yes, Erik Hobsbawm wrote that history as inspiration and ideology has a built-in tendency to become self-justifying myth. And this is a very important argument for us to understand that it's not, we cannot say that it's only nationalism or only that a certain part of existing socialism that used national myths to justify its own system, but that history, if we use it as inspiration and ideology, can become self-justifying myth. And he warns with this line that the revisionist tendencies of the 20th century will well endure into the 21st on the back of neoliberal politics. Mark Fisher, a critic and political theorist, published his famous Capitalist Realism in 2009, in which he gives an extensive self-reflective analysis of how culture has been shaped by the invisible hand of neoliberal hegemony. While Fisher's analysis shows how the postmodern is engraved in culture and the praxis of consumption and thus the commodification of culture, here the argument is that neoliberal revival of historicism is the commodification of history. I argue that that in the same token as the global classicist spread of capitalism, contemporary neoliberal culture creates seemingly exceptional and unique, but in their nature, ready-made languages of national form. In this way, nationalism, and thus the nation, becomes a commodity and a product that can be consumed, enjoyed, eaten, and drunken up in dedicated spaces of national belonging. There's a funny anecdote. 2 years ago, there was an exhibition in the National Museum in Budapest and it was kind of like a tragically fascist apologetic exhibition of the interwar years in Hungary. And you could actually have crème de monarchie, kind of little sweet afterwards that you could buy for an extra fee. And they actually had certain types of food made for this monarchical nostalgia. Yeah, so more about understanding the reasons behind this kind of nationalist nostalgia, especially in the Eastern Central European context. It's important to do so because this regional context gives a unique perspective on the free marketization of culture, as in the years between the Second World War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the state apparatus abused history not for the sake of the market, but for the sake of consolidation at different times. Therefore, I will not go into that era, but it's also part of my research. But in this part of my research, I argue that we see a revival of the postmodern appreciation of neoclassicism, a kind of neo-neoclassicism, because in the ECE region, the Eastern Central European region, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the nations that aimed to transition from state socialism into the Thatcherian free market economy model, the contemporary left effectively failed to put out a serious proposition in memory politics, architecture, and urban politics in general. In fact, the commodifying dimension of postmodernism benefited the new liberal leadership trying their hands in Western capitalist market economy. Thus, by the 2010s, with the great disillusionment of the economic system, Western democracy, and the European Union, and with the corresponding historical suspicion of the rising Eastern political power of China and Russia, the revision of national myths of autonomy and the fantastic national history became one with pro-government political identity. Also, we have to be reminded that the discourse on historical revisionism and the nationalism of contemporary neo-historicist architecture takes place exclusively in the academic and intellectual spheres. The general public, apart from a number of people who dislike everything that came from the government's hat, sees that public spaces are finally renovated and given a new image. This is a serious feedback that we usually get when we criticize these spaces, that people are actually not, they don't mind the reconstructions. Of course, they can be told the background story, but it doesn't really change the fact that they want to live in more decent places. In turn, the academic circles in disagreement, who have failed to include the public in their discourse, and of course, I include self-criticism in this as well, they often blame the ignorant masses for allowing or even enjoying these new spaces. Therefore, we see a dead end in both the way of resentment against nationalizing strategies and the finding of alternatives to them. For conclusion, and for a few words about the current state of affairs with the protection of urban heritage. In Hungary, the Institution for the Preservation and Protection of Urban Heritage is essentially made powerless. They were given the noble task since the 1990s to help big investors conduct their archaeological and historical work before pulling up residence park and office buildings in the city. As the leader of the institute has said, their task is mainly to help renovate privatized buildings. We have mentioned this earlier in the conference. While it can be said that the protection of national heritage should be subject to redistribution from taxes, the support the institution currently receives from the government, this way is far less than if it was financed by the market. So to conclude, I argue that the nationalizing principle of today's fascination with neo-historicism from the side of right-wing populism comes together with the commodification principle of the neoliberal market economy. The website of the Hausmann program that I showed you before, the quote is not here, but this is the website of the program that's renovating the Royal Palace in Buda. It says at some point that the project set at aim the development of our built heritage. This confused, mixed metaphor of heritage development, in quotation marks, highlights not only how the corporate lingua franca has penetrated how we deal with our culture, but also that heritage should be something that needs constant developing instead of tending to or taking care of. I also argue that this process essentially affects the Eastern Central European region, where the unreflected memory of socialist period, with the urge of Europeanization processes, creates classical narratives and forms of nation building. With keeping in mind that this is much rather a regional issue and just after that a global phenomenon, a real task is to first understand the historical conditions of contemporary right-wing populist culture and then to actively participate in coming up with a real alternative to it. Thank you very much.